Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start by the Egypt on the brink thing, because I get lots of credit for that. Pure luck. So just a book that came out a few months before the Arab uprising, not because I knew anything, just utter luck. Now, thank you for putting this. So purpose, of course, of this talk is to get you to buy this, basically. I have to start by two qualifications, and they're also a bit of an apology. One is I'm coming down with a bad cold, I think. So if I start to hallucinate, just remind me. And two is, to be very honest, I'm not going to speak to you about the future of Islam, and it's not something that I have written about. And actually, the very first thing that you will see if you read this book is that I make it very clear that I don't know actually what is the future of Islam, because simply also I do not know exactly what people mean when they talk about Islam. Without taking too much time, but Islam is basically a movement, a religion that came out of Arabia in the 7th century, and within less than a century was in the whole of the old world. And for 14 centuries after that, started to integrate and interact with different local cultures. And therefore, the Islam of Central Arabia, I would argue, is vastly different from the Islam of parts of Africa, from the Islam of Southern Egypt, from the Islam of Northern Egypt, that of the Levant, that of Morocco, let alone that of Indonesia, India. So if somebody is going to speak about the future of Islam, brilliant, but I think this would deserve volumes and volumes of books, and therefore those who come up with 50 pages and say this is the future of the religion, I found it interesting, to put it politely. What this book is about is something completely different. It's about the role of certain interpretations of the religion in society. And I think that the first word and the last word are really what matters, to me at least. In other words, you can argue the politicization of Islam. And I remember very well the first time I talked about this book and I mentioned this word, the politicization of Islam, somebody said, come on. From day one, Islam was politicized. Islam was a state from its very early days, very, very early days. Islam interacted with the countries that it expanded into as a political movement, many would say. And I agree. I totally agree with that. But in order to write a book that's manageable and that people buy, I cannot go to the very early story of Islam. And also, I think it's maybe not completely not relevant, really, to what's happening in the Middle East right now. So I focus on the last 200 years, and I'll tell you why the last 200 years, more or less. But before I delve into what I wanted, the ideas I wanted to throw on the table for you, hopefully to trigger some questions, is the other focus I mentioned, which is what's happening today in the Middle East. And I think that's an important third qualification. Islam is all over the world right now. As Professor Luke said, 1.6 billion Muslims in different parts of the world. Actually, a high percentage. I didn't know that this high percentage of Muslims in Europe, certainly a growing percentage in other parts of the world, North America certainly. But in this book, I very much focus on what I refer to as the wider Middle East, and that is the Arab world, in my definition at least, the Arab world, Turkey, and Iran, for two reasons. One, I would argue, but I would accept if others disagree with me, but I would argue that the really decisive part of the history of Islam and the history of political Islam in specific was formed in that part of the world. So some people might say, but that's meaningless because the largest number of Muslims right now are in India and Indonesia and Pakistan. So what you're talking about is actually not where the demographic majority of Muslims today are. And I accept that. Hence, I'm also talking about Islamism rather than Islam. That's another element why it's a bit different here. Because the future of the religion itself certainly will be shaped in whatever of its variations, but will be shaped by its adherents. But what I'm talking about largely is this politicization of the religion in the last 200 years is very much, in my view, in the core lands of Islam, which in my definition, the Arab world plus Turkey plus Iran. So why the last 200 years? I apologize for those of you who are very familiar with the Middle East, because maybe the initial part will be a little bit of maybe some boring history for you, but I think it's important, in my view at least, to set the scene for the point about the future. Everybody argues, and I think correctly, that the Arab world and the Ottoman Empire started to open up and really have a different type of interaction with the world in the 16th century. And I think that's correct. Without getting into too many details, but there was certainly the arriving of the printing machine, 17th century in the Arab world, lots of initial serious levels of trading between the Arab world and some parts of Europe to a very high percentages in terms of economic activity in both ways. All of that was late 16th and throughout the 17th century. But something extremely important happened at the beginning of, or the very end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, which is our dear, lovely friend, Mr. Napoleon, came to Egypt. And I think it's a fascinating story, by the way, to read some of what Napoleon himself wrote about Egypt and the logic. It's really fascinating. But why this was extremely important? Because it was so easy for Napoleon Bonaparte to take hold of Egypt. And actually, when you read some of the reports of some of his own people, which actually are still now preserved, some of them were really shocked because Egypt was the most important place at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. There were lots of preparations, and yet you found that it was very easy to take it over. What I'm trying to say is there was a shock for the French of how easy it was to not only take over Egypt, but to really cast aside the Ottoman forces that were stationed in Egypt. And for the Egyptians, and behind them lots of Arabs, lots of Muslims, and behind them the Ottoman Empire, it was a humiliation, of course, but number two, a shock. Have we really become so weak, so descended in our power relative to al-Ifrinj, which is an Arab Turkmen word which was more or less coming of a resonance to, or a reference to France, but by extension to the West? Have we become so powerless in front of the West to the extent that they just take us over like that, so easily? So humiliatingly, if you'd like. And I argue that this was, to my mind, the real beginning of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Some would say the Ottoman Empire fell 110 years after that, true, but I think this was the beginning. It was also the beginning of the Tanzimat. For those of you who have spent some time studying Turkey, this was the major reform momentum in Turkey in the 19th century. It was the beginning of the modern state in Egypt, later on in Tunisia. So 200 years ago, it is the moment of openness to us, to you, us as in we in the Islamic world, to you in the West, when we realized that actually, relatively, we have become so weak compared to you. Keep in mind that before that, there was still the Ottoman heritage, the Mamluk heritage of actually a real power in the Eastern Mediterranean, in North Africa, that the Ottoman Empire, of course, was on the verges of taking over Vienna 2-3 times. So this was a real shock, if you'd like. So this is why it's the last 200 years. But the very interesting thing is that the initial responses, almost without exception, and I think it's really an important point to start with, all of the initial responses that came from that part of the world were positive. By that, I mean, of course, you had people who were saying, oh, we have to stand up and we have to, in a very aggressive or sometimes assertive or sometimes aggressive ways. But to a very large extent, when you look at the writings of the most important thinkers in us, and I'll say why I'm saying us rather than Arab Muslims, because there's a distinction here. But in our part of the world, the most important responses were, one, almost always by religious leaders, because they were really the social leaders of the time, and almost always positive in the sense of it is not a confrontation with the West. It is we who have really lagged behind, and they who have really advanced a lot. And therefore, we need to learn from them and advance, coming from religious authorities. And I'll just draw your attention to two things that I find fascinating. There is a very famous book that came out in Egypt in the 1830s. It's called in Arabic, for those who speak Arabic here, تلخيص الإبريز في تلخيص باريس. I mean, it's even musical when you listen to it. It's so beautiful. But actually, it basically means extracting gold from Paris. Paris being Bariz, not Paris, but Bariz, as we at the time used to call it. And Ibriz is a classic Arabic word for gold. And the idea is very clear. You have a religious scholar from Al-Azhar, the oldest university in the world, older than Oxford, by the way, I have to say that. The oldest university in the world, as a religious scholar from there, saying that we really need to get gold out of the West. Before that, there was an amazing scholar, his name is Hassan al-Attar, who wrote also wonderful things about the idea of Islam needing in society, not religion, as a role in society needing to develop. What I'm trying to say, but I'll try to move a bit faster, otherwise we'll be here until 11. What I'm trying to say is that the initial responses came from religious authorities, did not came from politicians, from resistance movements against Western presence, primarily and almost always, I would say, from religious authorities, Muslim religious authorities, and at least the by far most important ones of them were conciliatory, were trying to say, we need to advance. How do we need to advance? As you can imagine, the very first things were in translation. So translating lots of the Comédie Française and blah, blah, blah. There was lots of education development. First time ever you found, ever in the history of the Arab world, that you find that educational system is becoming non-religious, rather secular. So you have educational system based on modern schools. We never had that before. You had, of course, the publishing machines being really developed big time. And you have something very important, which is in the mores of the society when it comes to women, for example, when interaction with men, when it comes to clothing, when it comes to art and culture, lots of stuff being developed a la Khawaga, a la Moderna, as we used to say. So more or less changing all of that. Another important milestone at that time is that not only you had some people who just write in books and from within the religious institutions and saying, yes, we need to advance a bit our social mores, you had at the most important religious establishments in the Arab/Islamic world, again, Al-Azhar, the oldest university in that part of the world, by far the most important seat of learning in Sunni Islam. And at the time, Sunni Islam and Shia Islam were much closer than they are today. And the head mufti, so the most important person in jurisprudence, in Islamic Sharia, for those who know the word, both of them, a person named Al-Afghani, another called Muhammad Abdu, basically themselves starting a movement, not just to write articles, but to change the curriculum of Al-Azhar itself, the educational curriculum of Al-Azhar itself, to move in terms of openness to a secular thinking. Does not mean that they're trying to change the religion. They're trying to change the role of religion in society. And the more important point, opening up to the idea of that we need to import a lot of ideas from them, you, who developed a lot, and we, who are really lagging behind. And I would say this is more or less the story of the 19th century to a large extent. But something crucially happened at the beginning of the 20th century, and that was the First World War, and with it, of course, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Because I think this was a crucial moment when the Ottomans, the British, the French, the Germans actually at the time as well, started to very much infuse a lot of religious rhetoric into an extremely bloody war, of course. Number two, the fall of the Ottomans by default opened up the Middle East and the Arab world to official foreign, mainly British and French, presence in the region. Professor Luc mentioned the Sykes-Picot, but basically the idea that the Ottoman Empire, these lands that were Ottoman, is now being carved to Western players. What I'm trying to say in a nutshell, again, trying to move slightly forward, is that specifically in politics, the idea of the enemy, the idea of the opposite of the occupier, started to take strong cementation of being Western. Of course, that was there in the 19th century. But in my view, and I'm happy to substantiate it, it was very minor compared to the huge cultural movement that was trying to catch up with the West. Early 19th century, early 20th century, and specifically because of the gradual and then massive fall of the Ottoman Empire, led to a massive change in how we started to see the Western presence in the Middle East. And it opened up politics. Think about it. The Ottomans have been in this part of the world for about 400 years, in some places over that. Yes, you had lots of institutions available, some political groups here and there, but to a large extent, from the mid-1500s to the late 1800s, mid-1500s to late 1800s, you really had very few political spaces open up in that part of the world, at least in the major urban centers, which at the time were North Africa and the Levant. The fall of the Ottomans effectively opened up the scene. That's why you had, for example, the Egyptian kingdom basically opened up at that time. The new modern Tunisian state came up at that time. Algeria was actually created as a modern state at that time. Morocco was evolved from some sort of a medieval caliphate into a modern state. On a religious system, yes, but on a modern state, modern kingdom. A number of countries obviously were created at the time. Jordan, Iraq, even modern Syria. Lebanon was carved out and became a country. You had the Saudis, a tribe basically, or a big family clan in Middle Arabia starting to say, hold on, we can make a country for ourselves right now. The Hashemites, basically descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, who were at the time ruling what's today Western Saudi Arabia, partnering with the British to fight the Ottomans because they wanted to have their own country. So basically, in the span of 20 years, incredible open spaces were created at the time. And at the same time, I'm saying the point about a lot of the interaction with the West became quite simply military, quite simply war, quite simply oppositional, as opposed to cultural movements. Some would say the cultural movement continues, and I agree, absolutely, continued wonderfully. But in the weight of things, at least in my assessment, there was a huge rise in the weight of politics now, of military stuff, of wars, of colonization. And in that sphere, Islam here became not just politicized, it became weaponized, if you'd like. Weaponized, as I said, by the Ottomans against the Western players. By the Western players, by the way, the Brits worked very closely with the Hashemites effectively to use the narrative that we, the Hashemites, are fighting the infidels, the British in this case, as Muslims against non-Muslims. You had groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood coming out of Egypt initially to resist the presence of the British in the Suez Canal, but later on to say, hold on, the whole society needs to rediscover really the idea of what it means to be Muslim. By the way, in a progressive way, you had groups coming out in Morocco, which at the time, as I said, was evolving from a medieval kingdom basically into a modern Islamic kingdom, but also trying to find few ideas of how Islam can become here an oppositional flag against the French presence. Keep in mind that Sultan Muhammad V, later King Muhammad V, the grandfather of the current Moroccan king, led an opposition against France on a religious basis, fundamentally. Of course, that was also the time when you had, even at the heart of Turkey itself, the Ottoman Empire itself, after it fell, you had a new narrative that coming out from Kemal Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Pasha at the time, who later on became the father of the Turks, Mustafa Atatürk, who basically said, again, people assume that he said some negative stuff about religion. He wasn't speaking about the religion. His view was primarily against the role of the religion. What I'm trying to give you here is a bit of a panorama that in this period in time, you had the cultural dimension I was talking about, which was led by religious scholars in the 19th century, taking a back seat. And really, the name of the game across the entire region, from Morocco to Turkey, down to Sudan, which, by the way, also witnessed some religious movements fighting the British, in Egypt, in the Gulf, whether it's the Saudis or the Hashemites, everybody was basically creating political states, regimes, fighting occupation, or occupiers using, everybody was using religion here in a highly weaponized and certainly politicized way. I call it the Big Bang, if you'd like, in this case, in the Arab world, because that was a space where you had all the players you see today, until today in the Arab world, emerged in that moment. Secular Turkey versus Islamist Turkey. Arab nationalist regimes versus very secular players. Saudi players versus new tribes taking and making countries in old Gulf places like today Emirates and Bahrain and Qatar and I don't know what. Sudan coming into a country. Egypt, as I said, all the players, Muslim Brotherhood, all of the players you are seeing today, the real moment of birth was that moment in time. And therefore, if you want to define Islamism, and I know it sounds weird, I've been speaking for 20 minutes and still haven't defined it. If you're defining Islamism based on that narrative, then I would say it is not, as most people say, the real definition of Islamism. If you say the term Islamism, most people will have two things in mind. Either we'll have ISIS or Al-Qaeda, will have basically militant groups. I always joke saying big beards and wild eyes in front on TV screens. Funny, but that's what people think of when you say Islamism. Or you think of political Islamist groups, Nahda in Tunisia, PJD in Morocco, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, AKP in Turkey. These are, yes, parts of a bigger story. But all what I tried to tell you in the past 20 minutes is that when you think of Islamism, if you define it as the role of Islam in society, the politicization of Islam in society, then all of that is forms of political Islam. The Saudi regime is a form of political Islam because its legitimacy, up to now things are changing, but up to now, its legitimacy was based on a religious mandate from the Wahhabi elite. The Moroccan kingdom is political Islam because the authority of the king is based on a religious positioning as a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. The Hashemite kingdom today in Jordan, and before that in Iraq, which fell, but today in Jordan, is a religious. The only religious basis upon which the only basis the Hashemites were accepted in Jordan is because of their descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Of course, you can argue that the secular Arab nationalist regimes, like the Nasser regime in Egypt, which continues until today, for example, like the Algerian regime, like even until Saddam Hussein was there in Iraq, or even the Assad regime. Forget about what's happening today, but the story of the Ba'ath movement, the political movement behind the Assad regime in Syria, all of these, though highly secular, they always partnered with the idea of that we are guarantors of the Islamic identity of our countries. We uphold Islamic Sharia in our countries, but in a ways that are suitable to our countries. What I'm trying to say, none of them were actually against fighting Islam in society. That's a very important point, because people usually assume that you have the Nasser regime in Egypt, for example, in the 50s, was secular and therefore anti-Islamic. Not really. It was actually using the institutions of Islam very much to solidify its own presence. And of course, in addition to that, you have what you think about, what most people think about, the political Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Nahda, the AKP, the PJD. And yes, you do have with that the militant Islamists. So my point is, in these 20 minutes plus, is trying to say that when somebody tells you Islamism, it is not the religion, as I tried to say initially, and it is not militancy, and it is not just people who claim we are an Islamist political movement. It is much, much wider than that. Iran, of course, is a political Islamic regime. Of course. I argue, though some of my Turkish friends disagree, but I argue that the AKP in Turkey is an Islamist regime. Yes, it upholds the secular notion of the Turkish state, but the main mandate, the main build-up that has been behind the AKP, whether under Mr. Erdogan or before that under Mr. Erbakan, is certainly based on a role of religion in a society that 80 years before that, Mr. Ataturk said, no, we don't want that role. The mandate itself, the idea itself, is based on Islam in society. That's a form of Islamism. All of that was a background. Now I'll start. Most people look at this and what's happening, this as in this book, sorry, and what's happening today and say, the universe was created in 2011, the Arab uprising. This is the moment of Genesis. And actually, I found it also quite reductive, as they say in English. 2011, the Arab uprising, the birth of Arab Spring, whatever you call it, opened up the Arab world, and I would say also Turkey and Iran to some extent, to another moment of creating spaces. Similar, obviously on a much smaller scale, but similar to the point when the Ottomans fell and you had spaces open. 2011 did something, in my opinion at least, something similar to that. You had huge places in the Arab world that were effectively closed for politics. North Africa, most clear example, was closed. There was no politics going on. The Gulf as in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, that part was closed. Syria, of course, was closed. As in, there's no politics. It just continuation was above. If anybody of you did some democracy promotion studies or read books coming out from democracy theorists, especially at Stanford University, there's a huge concentration there, you'd find that the books that were coming out in the mid-2000s, the fourth wave, third wave, and fourth wave of democracy, were always talking about the Arab exceptionalism, the idea that just let's ignore that part of the world. Nothing happens. Of course, 3 years after that, there was the Arab uprising, and everything was happening there. So that's my point. 2011 was interesting in the sense that it opened up primarily the Arab world, and again, in my view, Turkey and Iran, for stuff to happen. But it was not the moment of Genesis here. God did not create the Arab world in 2011. Even within the world of political Islam, loads of things were happening much before 2011. And that's another point or another message. If the first message was, what is Islamism in my view? This is the second message. 2011 was not the start, especially for political Islam, because really the most important, in my view, the most important developments in the role of Islam in society in that part of the world were happening much before that. I'll just give you a few examples. Militant Islam, for example, which everybody was now speaking about because of the birth of Al-Qaeda not in Afghanistan, but in our part of the world, more or less at the same time. The birth of ISIS at the same time. Guess what? Actually, this was a new phenomenon after at least 2 decades in which militant Islamism in the Arab world was going down. The real heyday of militant Islamism, actually, in the Arab world, especially places like Egypt, Algeria, partly southern Morocco, was actually in the 80s and the 90s, was not in the late 2000s and now. So if you want to look at really the major important thinking of militant Islamism, all of it being recycled today, but the most important organizational birth, ideological birth, groups, leaders even emerging, all of that happened in our part of the world, late 70s, 80s, and 90s. By the late 90s, actually, there were books even coming out by former militant Islamists who are saying, it's not the right way. This is not really the story. So interestingly, when 2001 happened, when 9/11 happened, it was actually the trend that was coming to the West was by our standards already going down. And you might say there's a connection here. Political Islam. The vast majority of people paid attention to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, to Al-Nahda in Tunisia, to the PJD in Morocco, to the AKP. I mean, AKP in Turkey is probably slightly different, but I would say also to the AKP in Turkey after 2011, after they started, at least in the Arab world, winning elections. But guess what? I think almost guaranteed you'll find the people who know these organizations quite well will say, the real change in thinking in all of these groups happened in the 90s. And there are 2 crucial moments when Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the very famous leader of Al-Nahda, and until today, the most important leader of Al-Nahda, wrote a series of books in which he was effectively saying that the role of Islam in society needs to have an immense change. And that was very influential on the thinking of all the Islamists in the Arab world. Also the mid-90s, when the Muslim Brotherhood, and later on, early in the 2000s, put forward their very first manifestos in which they were basically talking about their role in the Egyptian state, which was also interesting, because before that, it was always their role in the Ummah, in the Islamic nation, their role in the region. In the late 90s, there was a huge development in their thinking in which they were saying, all right, we acknowledge the dual identity, the idea that I am an Egyptian, I can belong to that, and I can also have a religious affiliation in a certain group, and which means that minorities, like Christians, for example, can also have a stake in the state, which by default meant the secularization of the state. Without getting into too many details, the real thinking of these groups, they did not come to the fore after 2011. They were there before. Morocco, the PJD, which is an amazingly interesting group, actually. The most important thinking that happened there, still led until today by Saad Din Othmani, the current Prime Minister of Morocco, by the way, and Abdelilah bin Kiran, the former Prime Minister of Morocco. The real contribution on taking the PJD from being a minor, marginal player into a real force in Moroccan politics happened in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s, when they were allowed to play in national politics. And of course, the two biggest stories, in my opinion, Turkey. The real big story in political Islam, Turkey, started, of course, much before 2011. The AKP came to power 2001, if I remember correctly, 2002. But if you'd like, the experience of President Erdogan at the time, Prime Minister Erdogan, which is incredibly important to study, I think, was throughout the decade before 2011, not after. And in my opinion, the most important story inside Iran, another crucial story in political Islam, was Mohammad Khatami and the group that were around him. Mohammad Khatami was the president of Iran in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he was by far the most important reformist from within the religious establishment, Shia religious establishment of Iran. And until today, by the way, the two or three key figures, liberal figures in Iran, are from within the group that coalesced around Mohammad Khatami in the 90s. Again, I don't want to speak forever, but what I'm trying to say is, even in Iran, by far the most important thinking and development within political Islam happened before 2011, not after 2011. This is why, to a large extent, but that's a long debate, I'm not going to go into it, but this is one of the reasons, at least, why the Islamists played really well politically, I think, in the moment of 2011. They were very sophisticated. They have gone through a lot of real politics, unlike many other groups, by the way, in that part of the world. But this is the second message I wanted to leave you with, that this fascination with the Arab world and what happened in it in the last 5 or 6 years, of course crucial, but especially if you want to understand and think about political Islam, I think the 10, 15 years before 2011, in my view, were decisive in the shaping of the thinking, whether political thinking, political Islamist thinking, militant Islamist thinking, major countries that are pillars of political Islam, Turkey and Iran, in my opinion, as well as some of the interesting stories on the side, such as Al-Nahda, such as the PJD in Morocco. Today, if the title of this talk is The Future of all of that. If you are looking at the future, given what happened in this part of the world in the last 6 years, and given the very diverse definition I try to convince you with, and given the importance of the 10, 15 years before 2011, if you are thinking today about the future, where would you, what would you, you know, as they say in scenario analysis, it's not really, it's almost impossible that you say where we'll end up, but at least start to put the tree of where would you look, and for each branch of the tree, where can the tree go? It's like the thinking process, if you'd like, as opposed to where the destination is, because nobody obviously knows where the destination is. But I want to leave you with few ideas. The first idea is that I think the three key countries, and I would say maybe with a fourth, and I'll mention the fourth, that have been real pillars of the story of political Islam in the last 20 years or so, or 20 years, shall we say, 15, 20 years, are all of them at moments of transition. Saudi Arabia obviously is the biggest one. Saudi Arabia has been the heartland of the richest and most powerful, as I mentioned before, in my view, political Islamist regime. As we are seeing today under a new leadership, it is going under an immense transformation, but not just socioeconomically, not just geopolitically. It is fundamentally about the role of the religion in society. People say it's about the legitimacy of the Saudi family. True, yes, but it's much more than that. The alliance between the Wahhabi religious establishment and the Saudi family has dictated the entire role of Islam in Saudi society for the past. People would tell you 70, 80 years. I would disagree with that, but certainly in the last 40 years. This is now being changed. Why it's important? Because Saudi is crucial. Saudi is super rich. Saudi is incredibly influential. Saudi has by far the largest media presence across the Middle East. Saudi is the largest funder of so many missionary, if you'd like, groups across the world, or traditionally has been. So the future of the role of Islam in society in Saudi Arabia is crucial. This is an area I think that needs a lot of studying. Another point that I think is crucial is Turkey. Turkey is a successful, irrespective of what many people say, it's certainly a successful story from the Turkish point of view. And that's an important point. Because I know I'm sitting here in the heart of the European Union, and I see some friends from the European Union. And I know how they see Turkey, and I totally agree. There's immense concerns about what's happening in Turkey. But if you look from the vast majority of not the vast, but from the majority of Turkish, they see that the experience of Turkey in the last 15 years was positive. It's almost an agreed narrative in the country. And whether it's true or not, it's not important. But right now, Turkey, that experience of the last 15 years is owned, if you'd like, by a certain strand of political Islam, which is the AKP. The future of that is very important, especially that we have seen repeatedly now that there's huge tension between secular Turkey, top-down Turkey for the past 70, 80 years, Kemalist Turkey, and that's the most important socio-political experience that tried to limit the presence of Islam in society. All of that is in serious polarization with an extremely successful experience, which is that of President Erdogan and the AKP behind him. Another area I think that's certainly worth studying, I would say, and following really closely, because I think it will have immense influence on the future of the role of Islam in society. And the third one is Iran. And I know this one is a bit contentious because you find a number of people saying, no. Iran is Shia, and Shia Islam is very different from Sunni Islam. And that's true. For those who are not familiar with the details, you can think of Shia Islam in Catholic terms, if you'd like. It's very institutionalized. It has a hierarchy, something that is not existent in Sunni Islam. And also the emotional experience, and I know it sounds funny when I say that, but I mean it, the emotional experience of Shias throughout history is very different from the emotional heritage within Sunni Islam. And therefore people say you cannot put Iran as an important story because it's a unique story. And I agree with that, it's a unique story, but there are two things that are very important. Iran has expanded significantly in the last 5 to 7 years. Iran is now a major player in the Eastern Mediterranean. There has been huge links between the Levant, historical Levant, and Iran. Iran now actually is putting itself, and has been putting itself forward for many groups in the Arab world, whether in the Gulf, whether in the Levant, and you'd be surprised, even some groups of course in Arabia, in Yemen, for example, but also some groups in North Africa, as let's try to transcend the sectarian difference, and let's look at our model as in this case, an elected president under some sort of a theological authority. Without getting too much into the details of the Iranian experience, and I know I already over my time, what will happen in Iran is important. Iran is a very important country. It's a very big country demographically, economically, politically, strategically, militarily, and more importantly, it's a big civilization. And that's an important point. There are few huge civilizations in that part of the world. And if you have a civilization, it's basically Egypt and Iran. And if you have a country like Iran with that civilizational depth, having 35 years of an Islamic republic and continuing democratically, irrespective of whether 2009 had issues in the elections or not, overall, the experience is moving on a certain trajectory that has lots of democratic tenets to it. If you have that in a country with the huge civilizational presence and depth and weight of Iran, that will be a success. That will add a lot to the gravitas, if you'd like, of the role of Islam in the Middle Eastern societies in the future. The final story, by far less important in weight, but certainly worth paying attention to, is the story of Morocco. Because Morocco is developing something interesting. Morocco is the only country so far that is graduating institutionally and constitutionally from a legitimacy that has been by the book, based on Islam, based on the king being the commander of the faithful, a caliph, basically, into a system in which there is a move towards a constitutional monarchy where that remains, but really executive power is diluted. Irrespective of people saying, well, but that's true or not, and the power of the palace or not. What I'm trying to say, there's something, especially for those who are inclined to look at institutional development and legal basis and constitutions, there's something very interesting happening there. It's very slow, very subtle, but it's the only experience so far ever in that part of the world where you have this constitutional/institutional evolution from a religious basis of legitimacy and ruling towards something that is different from that. My final point, and I'll shut up, I'm getting very dirty looks here, and I'll shut up, is Islam in Europe. It's something I do not cover in this book. So sadly, if you're interested, you will not buy the book. But it is interesting for me because I always argued, and actually I made that argument at the beginning of this book, and actually at the beginning of this talk as well, that the reason I focus on the Arab world, on Iran and on Turkey, it's not just because I know it quite well, but it has been, as I tried to mention earlier, has been the decisive region in the formation of political Islam, in the formation of the modern politicization of Islam, in the shaping of the role of Islam in society. But there are now very interesting things happening in Europe. I'm not qualified really to comment on too much of them because I don't spend too much time in Europe anyway, but I follow them, I try closely. There are now second, and some would say third generation Muslims in Europe, in different parts of Europe. And they are facing very interesting things. Professor Luc mentioned the issues about whether Muslim communities are super welcomed or not particularly welcomed or under pressure or not. But the point is that debate is putting pressure on them to integrate more, to be more in the limelight, to put their own narrative. This is interesting. To me, as somebody who looks at the role of Islam in society, it is interesting. It means that the ball now is in their court, as they say in America, for them to put up something different than more or less being a minority waiting for protection from the state, if you'd like. And a narrative that they own. And for me, it's interesting what kind of narratives that will be. The second point, which I think is interesting, is that we're already seeing some politicians, serious politicians, coming from minority Islamic groups in Europe who are trying to take a leading role within secular structures. I mean, the most obvious example is the mayor of London today, of course, Sadiq Khan. But I do know that there are other examples. I don't know in Belgium, to be very honest, but I do know that in France there have been a number of examples. And there's an evolution. Rather than somebody who tries to embrace totally the secular structure and more or less say, I'm just, irrespective of my religion, I'm a citizen, which is a very European, probably very French thing as well. To be honest, it doesn't work because clearly the role of Islam and the label of Islam is very important. And now I am seeing at least, but correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I am seeing some politicians who are saying, yeah, hold on, I am also Muslim, and by the way, there is a role of Islam within Europe that's very different from the role of Islam back home, if you'd like. And that is an interesting thing. And the final point is a bit theological, so I'm not going to bore you to death with it. But there are very interesting theological innovations within Islam. really interesting, actually. And by far, the most important people who are putting these interesting theological ideas are Muslims in Europe, whether second or third generation Muslim in Europe or Muslim converts in Europe. And I think that's also very interesting right now, because there is some theological innovation taking place in the Arab world. You'll be surprised, even in very conservative places such as Saudi Arabia. But it's as the Italians say, sotto voce. We should not talk about it, dangerous. But in the West, it's happening in the limelight. People are writing about it. There are, in the Netherlands, actually very clear. There are already talks about it in universities and debates, and sometimes very heated debates. But that's very interesting, because it's not new. There have been lots of theological innovations in Islam, but there's been nothing in the limelight, certainly for the last at least 70, 80 years, at least, if not more than that. And all of these developments are happening in the West. Maybe it's my ego, being an Arab man, being an Egyptian, that I think, oh no, of course it will be us who will, what happens in our land will be really the evolution of the story of Islamic society. But I cannot dismiss what's happening by Muslims in Europe. So what I'm trying to say, in addition to the stories I drew your attention to, or at least hope that you pay more attention to if you're interested in this topic, what's happening here as in Europe, is also interesting. I apologize, I spoke for 50 minutes, not 40, but happy to take questions.
Thank you very much.